use one word summarize what we have learned in the previous module, which is measurement. We learned how to measure in GDP. We learned how to measure in the labor market. We learned how to measure in the price level. That's what we learned. And then in this module, use one word to summarize what we're trying to do is to understand the mechanism. We understand the mechanism behind those numbers, right? So from the discussion of the previous module or from the measurements discussion, we have noticed the economy fluctuate all the time. Among those fluctuations, the most important things we care is GDP. Okay, so GDP fluctuate, but GDP, certainly GDP means different things, right? And the GDP means three things to us. Let me write that. But certainly this also connect to how we measure GDP. GDP means income, means spending, means product or production. Right, but certainly these are three ways to look at GDP. But on the other hand, this also means GDP has three different interpretations. Right, so we care about the fluctuation of GDP. Why? Because we care about income, cares about spending, cares about product. Right? So this is the key sense. Or in other words, in this module, starting from this lecture, the key things we're going to study is to understand what determines GDP. Here I use Y to denote the GDP. We care about what determines the fluctuation of GDP. But then, so how we are going to understand or how we are going to proceed. Right, so we are going to rely on one equation. Let me write down this equation and explain to you so why we use this equation. Okay. So the equation we are going to rely on is going to be Y equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Where is this equation coming from? Anyone remember where we come up with this equation? The hint is here. Where we come up with this equation? This is not how we measure GDP through expenditure, right? Okay, so that's how we end up with this equation. Okay, for now, so we are going to rely on this equation to understand what determines Y. Okay. We want to simplify the matter a little bit. When we start the discussion, I'm going to erase or ignore this last two terms. We're going to rely on this equation. But this is not enough, because from this equation, it only tells you you can look at GDP by looking at the expenditure. The key is that, so we are going to see or to write C as a function of Y, I as a function of Y. Before I explain to you why we write it this way and what this means to us, let me ask you a question. If you can write an equation like this, okay, what are you going to get out from this equation? Or mathematically from this equation, what you can solve? From this equation, just mathematically. There's one equation. Just pure mathematically, what you can get from this equation. This is the equation of what? What is unknown in this equation? Right. Thank you. So basically, from this equation, you can solve Y. Right? Or in other words, let me just kind of recap. In other words, like I said, we care about the fluctuation of Y. We want to know what determines y. Now, this equation is going to tell you, okay, so I'm going to tell you the answer because this equation is going to solve for y. But certainly, I need to explain to you why you write c as a function y, why I write I as a function y. Right? So, but for now, mathematically, you can solve for y from this equation, number one. Number two, write down, number one, we can solve for y. Number two, if there's any disturbance or there's any distortion or shock to the economy. And then from this equation, you can immediately see what causes the fluctuation. Can you see that? Because whenever you have some like a disturbance or some fluctuation in this equation, and then so you can solve for different y. Does that make sense? To summarize, so if we understand this equation, certainly that's the main objective of this and the next chapter. If we understand this equation, and then so from this equation, we are going to learn what determines GDP and what causes GDP to fluctuate. So that's the goal for this module. Right? So the reason why I brought this up front is because in this lecture and the next lecture, without knowing this big picture, you're going to get lost. Because once we start this lecture, you're going to see some very technical aspect. If without this big picture, you don't know where we are heading to. Here, I just give you a big picture where we are heading to. So summarize, we try to understand the fluctuation of y or the determination of y. The way we do is just follow this equation. And while we have this equation, this is coming up. But again, so this equation is going to serve the purpose to understand the determination of y, to understand the fluctuation of y. And you may ask one more question, why we care about the fluctuation of y? Because we want to improve our standard of living. We don't want to suffer. And furthermore, so what we can learn, what we can get from this understanding. So you're going to design better government policy. So that's the goal. That's just leads to the next chapter. Is it clear? Right. So this is a big overview. What are we going to study in this entire module? Right. Now, in this particular lecture, essentially, we are going to focus on two things. Number one is the consumption function. But this consumption function is exactly this term. The other thing we're going to study in this lecture is going to study the determinants of investment spending. But it's exactly this term. Once we understand this each term, and then so we end up with this equation, and in the next chapter, we're going to study how we're going to determine y. If you ever have experience with like playing with Lego, and then so the best way to understand what we are doing here is, so first you have a big picture in your mind, what are you going to get in together? And then so you're going to piece the small piece together and get like a block by block, and then do the assembly at the end. Right, so here what I'm trying to do is just give you the big picture, otherwise you're going to get confused or get lost. Now let's just start with this chapter. So the first thing we are going to study is consumption function. But before we understand consumption function, we need to understand two important concepts. Number one is called multiplier. What is multiplier? Here's an example to help you to understand what is multiplier. There's an example in the end of this slide. In this example, it asks you what will happen if these things happen. Okay. To be precise, if UNMC is building a new hospital with a budget of $1 billion, how much does this affect the local economy? And to be precise, how much would that affect the GDP? Okay. To help you to understand these questions or to make these things, the analysis tractable, let's just make the following a few simplified assumptions. Number one, let's assume Omaha is completely isolated from the rest of the United States or rest of the world. Everything happens inside. Meaning, if you want to build a new hospital, engineer must come from Omaha. Raw material must come from Omaha. The design coming from Omaha. Everything happened in Omaha. This is for simplicity, right? Number two, to help you understand this question, let's say, for example, in a regular year, Omaha, the total GDP, let's just simplify, right? So the actual number, I don't know, but it's not very important. Let's say, for example, in regular year, Omaha has a total GDP of 100 billion. This also just means the total spending is 100 billion, total income is 100 billion. Now, this question asks you if in 2023, UNMC is going to spend 1 billion to build a new hospital. Now I'm asking you, so essentially this asking you is, so in 2023, what is going to total spending in Omaha? Is 101 or it's greater than 101 or less than 101? That's the question. What would be your answer before I tell you what actually happened? There are three choices: equal to 101, greater than, or less than. What would be your guess? Remember, there are a few assumptions we made, right? So Omaha is completely isolated. This 1 million is going to spend inside Omaha. And furthermore, I also want to say, so maybe another useful assumption is, so to build this hospital is not going to affect other activity. Everything is going to go as busy as usual, like previous year. Now, what would be the total spending in 2023 in Omaha? What would be your guess? Yeah. Yeah. So that one still, yeah, like I said, business as usual. So you do whatever you're supposed to do. But now suddenly there's like a new hospital under construction, and then there's another $1 billion will be spent inside the economy. Now the question asks you, what will be the total spending? Yes. Yeah, I mean, do you have, yeah.
I think it would cost. It would be 100. It would be more than.
It's more than 100. Okay, the answer is exactly correct. Now we need to understand why it is more than 100, right? Okay, so let's just use this blank space to explain to you why it's going to be more than 100. Normal year, 100 billion. So this is going to stay there, right? So this is our starting point. Now you have 1 billion to build a hospital. In order to build a hospital, they need to hire engineer, hire construction worker, purchase raw material, right? Or in other words, they need to spend 1 billion. But remember, to simplify the analysis, we say, so the Omaha economy is isolated, meaning this 1 billion is going to spend inside Omaha. This means there's some income increase by 1 billion, right? Somebody in Omaha, collectively, their income is going to increase by $1 billion. Does that make sense? Okay, so for those somebody who have collectively received additional $1 billion, what they are going to do? Are they going to save all their money? No. What is a reasonable scenario? They spend, right? They spend, okay? Let's just make up some number. They spend 600 million. If they spend 600 million, remember again, so Omaha is an isolated place. This is for simplicity. So meaning, what this means? income increased by another 600 million, right? Because you either go to watch a movie or just buy a better house or build a better house, right? So on and so forth. Now, you can see, so you have original 1 billion spending. Now you have a second round of 600 million spending. This already exceed 101. The actual number right now is already 101.6. Right? And this is not going to stop here. So this is 600 million because it's going to somebody else's income. And further, they're going to spend. And this process is going to keep moving. Right? And why this process keep moving? There are two reasons. Number one, you have income, maybe like 3 reasons. Okay, but yeah, 3 reasons. Number one, each dollar I spend becomes somebody else's income. Number one. Number two, for any dollar we earned, most likely we are going to spend. It's almost impossible you don't spend. Otherwise, why you want to earn in the first place? Number two. Number three, so the entire economy, everybody are intrinsically connected. But the number three is kind of like a number one. Right? So these three things explain why the net impact on our economy is more than $1 billion. People are connected. People spend. Right? So now you understand this, we look at a few definitions. Marginal propensity to consume. So this is defined as your propensity in the margin to spend the money you receive. Look at this example. If your income increased by $10, your income increased by $10, you spend $6 out of this 10. And then so your marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to consumer, the same thing, MPC equal to 6 divided by 10 equal to 0.6. This is MPC. But this MPC goes to the example I had earlier. You have 1 billion spending, becomes 1 billion income. 1 billion income, you spend a fraction, is 0.6, meaning 600 million, and so on and so forth. Right? So this 0.6. Now, the other important thing is I want to share with you is for any income or any additional income, let me just use additional income. It's just delta here usually means increase, okay? Additional income. What option you have with $1 additional you have? Besides consume, what else you can do? If you have $1 coming from somewhere, besides consume, what else you can do? The only other alternative, which is to save, right? To save. Now, given this equation, immediately you're going to have another interesting or important formula or identity. You divide both sides by delta or change in income. What do we get on the left-hand side? 1. Right-hand side, this term is MPC. And then so we call this term MPS. Right? So let me erase here. So this is how we derive this one. Actually, this goes to the end of this slides. MPS equal to 1 minus MPC. Why? Is because for each dollar of income we have, you either spend or you save. Right? Can you think about other alternative? No. But sometimes maybe people may say, okay, what happens if I lost my money? And you can categorize that as consumption. And then somebody says, okay, so what happens if I just donate my money? And probably you can also classify this as consumption. Right. Okay. Now we have this multiplier effect. right? And then so with the MPC, we can even find out what is the actual site of this multiplier effect. Just imagine if the investment spending in our country increased by 100 billion. Now to follow the discussion we just had, so there's going to have a chain rule or domino effect. Because 100 billion has become somebody else's income. Somebody else is going to spend, how much is it going to spend? It's going to spend this amount. This spending goes to income. In income, you're going to spend this amount. Now this spending goes to income here, and then it's multiply MPC, that's how much you're going to spend, and so on and so forth. We add them together, we are going to get this formula. So by the way, here, this one corresponds to this first term, MPC corresponds to this term, MP squared corresponds to this term, so on and so forth. From your pre-calculus, I think you learned this from pre-calculus, is that right? Or you're learning calculus? I mean, it's from this term inside the parentheses to this simple term. You have seen these people, did you?
Oh, yeah.
You can forget, okay. But luckily these days with artificial intelligence, you can try. You can ask the ChatGPT, show how we get from, you can try, okay. So I'm very confident that he can give you a very intuitive explanation, how we come from here to here. But this is not the focus in this class. For us, we take this math as given. But this simple term is going to give us a multiplier. So essentially just tells us $1 spent in the net term is going to have more than $1 impact on our economy. Right? Why I say it's more than one, mathematically, just look at it here in the denominator. This is a number between 0 and 1. Why is the number between 0 and 1? Because MPC is between 0 and 1. So now use 1 divided by a number smaller than 1 and a positive. You must have a number greater than 1. This is mathematically. And economically, intuitively, so I have $1 I spend, immediately have $1 impact on the economy. Now I spend $1 becomes somebody else's income, somebody else can spend. So now the impact is more than 1. And this process keep moving because we are intrinsically connected. Right? So this is a multiplier. Right. And here there's a quick discussion. I will leave that for you to work out yourself. But essentially just replay what we have discussed. Right. So here just ask you if there's an increase of $200 investment, essentially spending. And we have MPS of 0.2. And then ask you to trace out how would that affect our economy. And finally, what would be the impact on the total GDP? So the answer is here. Okay, I leave that for you to work out yourself. But this is kind of replay what we just discussed. Okay. Right. So now here we have another important concept. It's called autonomous change in aggregate spending. So this autonomous change in aggregate spending is related with the MPC. Okay, so change in GDP equal to the multiplier times autonomous change in aggregate spending. Or we can reverse, so we can derive this multiplier. Right, so this is going to be very useful for our later discussion when we study the government policy, right? All right, so now let's finish this part by looking at this practice question. Holding everything else constant in the economy, the larger the MPS, what happened to multiplier? So the multiplier equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. So MPS increase implies MPC is going to decline. And then this entire term is going to increase. And finally, the multiplier is going to decrease. Right? So it's very straightforward. Okay. But also you can think about this very intuitively. NPS increase. That means each round people save more, spend less. And then collectively, the impact is smaller, right? Okay, so now let me show you an interesting case study to show you the existence of multiplier in reality. And in this case study, so we look at US economy for time period of 2006 to 2010. Does anyone know what happened to our macroeconomy in that time period? What event happened? That was right. It was a great recession. And it was caused by the housing market collapse. Now, the housing market collapse immediately is going to have impact on employment in construction, right? Because people are not going to buy a house, and then the construction workers will lose their job. First of all, this is precisely what happened in this construction sector. But if we look into the data and take a closer look at the data, if we differentiate between sand state and non-sand state, you can see the decline in employment in sand state is much more significant compared with non-sand state. But what's the difference between sand state and non-sand state? So sand state usually include in these states. What are those states in common? Or how these states different from Nebraska, say for example? They're warmer, right? Actually, they have another name. It's called the Sun Belt. Okay. They're warmer, and then so usually it means their housing market is hotter. Just imagine you have money. You want to have a vacation house, or you want to have a retirement home, or you want to have an investment property. You probably more likely to what? To go to those sand state, right? Now, if there's housing market collapse, and then this market is going to collapse faster. So that explains why in the sand state, the employment declines much sharper compared to non-sand state, right? So this is step number one of our story. However, so if we look at non-construction, even though nothing happened in that sector, still people lost their job. This is the first piece of evidence of multiplier or connecting. Construction sector worker lost their job, lose their income. They're going to decrease their spending, right? They decrease spending, that's going to spill over or it's going to affect other non-construction sector. And furthermore, if we look at the non-construction sector by sand state versus non-sand state, and clearly in the sand state, the impact is bigger because there are more workers lost their job. Certainly the multiplier is going to be bigger. Right? So from this case study to show you, so our economy are intrinsically connected. Right? So the multiplier, indeed, it exists. All right, so now we are ready to look at the C function. Let me rewrite. So at the beginning, like I said, we are trying to find out y, and y equal to C of y plus I of y. Now we have made enough preparation to understand what is C of y. Okay. The C is households consumption. Right? If you ask yourself or ask anyone, what is the most important factor determine your consumption behavior? What is the most important factor? When you make your consumption decision, what is the most important things matter to you? Purchasing power. In our language, that's your income. The same things, right? And then the furthermore income, you care, so what is more important? Pre-tax income or after-tax income? After-tax. And then here's what we call is your disposable income. That's after-tax, right? So your disposable income is the most relevant factor or most important factor that affects your consumption decision. Now we are ready to have a consumption function. So essentially, this the function tells us how our consumption behavior will look like, depending on some key factor, which is disposable income. So this is the equation. So C is your consumption on the left-hand side. Right-hand side of this equation, YD essentially is your income. But remember, so income, expenditure, product, or equal to GDP. So in some sense, you can say this is also GDP. But that's linked to the equation I wrote very earlier. But now here it just says, okay, so C is going to depend on your income, disposable income, right? Now C, depending on income with a factor of MPC. This is what we just discussed, right? For each dollar you have, you'll want to save a fraction, and then the rest goes to saving, right? And that's this MPC just capture that behavior. Now, finally, you have A. What is A? Mathematically, look at A. A is equal to C when Y equal to 0, or C equal to A when Y equal to 0. And then that just means A is what you're going to spend when your income equal to 0. Then you ask yourself, what is I must consume even with 0 income? What are those things you have to spend, even have no income? Just leave aside, so how you can spend for a second, or how you can pay for that for a second. If you have no income, you still need to spend. What are those things? Water, very basic sense, right? Otherwise you're going to die. Or in other words, so this A is what you need to spend to survive, right? But certainly, then the question is, if I have 0 income, yes, I must spend so that I can survive, but how I can pay for those spending? What do you think? What happens in reality? You have no income, but still have to consume. How I'm going to pay for those consumptions? Like you mentioned, food, water, basic shelter. Yeah. Government or like charity, right? So like government. So just to give you an example, like food stamp, if you heard about, or like Medicaid, if you heard about, right? Some minimum, some like social safety, like social security, if you heard about. So those are the things to pay for your A, which is the minimum consumption, so that you can survive, right? Right. So now we have a few like a manipulation regarding to the equation. Those are pretty straightforward. I guess probably going to skip these and I'll go to the next one. Look at the practice question to understand this consumption function. Suppose Sue, when her disposable income is 10,000, she spent 8,000. When her income is 20,000, she spent 14,000. Now the question asks you, what is her autonomous spending, and then what is her MPS? So first we need to write down the equation, right? C equal to A plus MPC times Y. And then there are two things we need to determine, A and MPC. Okay, and certainly you can do this very brute forcefully, like purely mathematically, without much economic thinking. And then you're going to create two equations. How are you going to create two equations? You're going to use this information. To be precise, so 8,000, when my income is 10, 14,000, when my income is 20. And then immediately you have two equations, right? So from these two equations, you can immediately solve for A and MPC. This is pure mathematical brute forcely. But now I would rather use our economic thinking, but then the same thing, right? So how would I do? I'm probably just going to find out MPC equal to change in income, change in consumption divided by change in income, right? So what is the change in consumption? 8,000 to 14,000, that is 6,000. Income change from 10,000 to 20,000, that's 10,000. So that gives you 0.6 MPC. Now you plug in this MPC into either this equation or this equation. Immediately you're going to find out A. All right. Now in terms of answer this question, you need to be careful. Don't get tricked. So this asks you what is her MPS, not asking you what is her MPC. But MPS equal to 1 minus MPC. So the answer naturally is going to be D. Okay. So this is for the consumption function. So this is how the consumption function look like. Right. Our horizontal line is your disposable income. Vertical line is your consumption. And the slope of this line is given by MPC. Because look at how we define the slope. Slope is just delta y divided by delta c divided by delta y. But immediately that equal to MPC. By the way, here I want to pause for a second. Let me ask you a question. Seriously, if you have $100 additional income, 100 probably just too small to think about. If you have additional $10,000 income in 2023, how much are you going to spend? I'm sorry?
Over.
You spend all of it. Let me write down. Okay, so you have student one. So he said he's going to spend 100%. What else? How much you're going to spend? Yeah, you're going to spend half of it. If you ask me, I probably just spend like 10%. If you additional 10,000. And then, but why we just look at here, we only have one MPC. Clearly, so even in my classroom, you ask 3 different people, have 3 different MPC. But why we look at one MPC? How we reconcile these? Average, exactly. Remember, this is macroeconomics. We look at average. Earlier on, when we look at CPI, like each household, their consumption habit is different. Let's give you a simple example. I never drink coffee. I know some people just cannot survive without coffee. I never drink coffee. Right? But then, so we just look at a CPI, just look at what? So we just look average. Same here. So MPC, we look at average. Factor in, you have different age. My saving habits, I might save more because like 2 reasons. One, so my income is fairly higher compared to yours. The second is, so I'm in the age, there's not of spending in front of me. Like so my older child, so he's going to enter college in 2 years. Younger ones enter college in 6 years, right? So I have to save. Right? So people are different, like different age, different income, or even with different cultural background. But then, so we should look at average Americans. So what their saving behavior look at. So that's why. And by the way, so actually, so if we look at the data, so we have 2 slides to show the data. So this is the first slide. Literally, so each dot represent a household in the United States. Okay, so overall, so these dots, if you connect all the dots together and then you find out, so the MPC is kind of constant overall, right? Okay, so now we these slides, right? So this is the consumption function, right? To finish this discussion, the slope is the MPC, the interception is A. What is A? Is what you must consume, even your income is 0. Okay, so that that's just something you have to survive, right? But clearly, so this C is different. It's different from state to state, from economy to other economy, right? But this is sorry, the A. I'm saying A is different, right? Okay, so here I just capture the overall, the average, right? So you may be wondering, so these equations is very simple, very stylized. How does it match with actual economy? Okay. Look at 2013. So this is how the actual data look at. So each dot represent a household. Okay, each dot represent a household. Now, if we just trying to find a line to feed those dots, so that's what we end up with. And you can see you can have a straight line to feed these dots. Or in other words, if we look at the 2013, the consumption function we just postulated fits with data fairly good. Or in other words, so it seems like the consumption function we just discussed is a good theory to describe the overall behavior of American households, right? And then, so we are going to put them together. We are going to get aggregate consumption function. Essentially, we are going to switch from lowercase to capital case. Lowercase for individual, capital case is for aggregate. Start with C, now it's aggregate consumption. A is just aggregate autonomous spending. And the YD essentially is aggregate disposable income. MPC is the same, right? So this aggregate consumption function. Right. Now let's look at this practice question. Assume aggregate consumer spending equal to 5,000 when aggregate disposable income is 0. When disposable income increase from 300 to 400, consumer spending increased by 70. What is the equation for the aggregate consumption function? So the aggregate consumption function from the previous slides is determined by two parameters. One is capital A, the other is MPC. Let's start with MPC. What is MPC here? To find out the MPC, the key is here, right? So the key information is given by this line. When income increases from 300 to 400, your consumption increased by 70. So hence your marginal propensity to consume equal to 70 divided by 100. Where's 100 coming from? 300 to 400. That's 100 increase in income. 70 divided by 100. That equals to 0.7. This is MPC. Now, what is A? A here, look at this equation. This is when your disposable income equal to 0. Right? Now look at this question, this problem. Consumer spending equal 5,000 when aggregate disposable income equal to 0. Hence immediately we have answer C. All right, so this is aggregate production, aggregate consumption function, actually as a function of disposable income. Now we are going to see, so what can cause this function move or fluctuate. So once we understand that, and then remember the equation we talked earlier, y equal to C plus I. If C fluctuates, because C is a function of y, and immediately that's going to give you the fluctuation of y. Actually, so we are going to pick up that in more details in the next lecture. For now, let's see what can cause the consumption function to change. It could move up, like showing this slides. So what does that mean? There's everyone increase their consumption. Even your income is given, regardless who you are. Intuitively, when this is going to happen? Give you two choices. You are fearing we are entering a recession, or everyone believes so there's like a new technology. It's going to make our economy booming. Under which case, the consumption function is going to move up. A boom or a recession? A boom, right? Why? Because there's less incentive for you to save, because you know, so you are going to have more and more income. On the other hand, On the other hand, so when you are expecting the economy is entering a recession, or alternatively, if the housing market collapse, because remember in the US, so many of us relies on housing market to what? To accumulate our wealth. Right? If there's housing market collapse, or if there's a stock market collapse, what would you expect your consumption? Move up or move down? Move down, right? Because everyone becomes pessimistic, or you have less wealth for you to spend, right? So this is what I can call this curve shift up and shift down. To summarize, change in expected future disposable income and a change in aggregate wealth. And furthermore, we can look at history to see how this is going to change our consumption behavior collectively. In these slides, there are two graphs. On the left-hand side is the data for 1930. Now, everyone knew what happened in 1930. By the way, so each dot in the left-hand side, let's see them here. So these dots is 1933. Or in other words, these dots just tells us in 1933, what is the total disposable income of our nation? And what is total consumption in our nation? And certainly we are converted into the $7 or like return in here. So you can see, so we just use 2005 as the base year, right? So then it's easier to compare. First, we will look at 1930. So we just put all those dots in this diagram. What do we see? So you can see there's a straight line. There's a straight line, almost perfectly fit with those dots. And what we learn from the left-hand side. So essentially, in 1940, so there's a perfect consumption function to approximate the nation's behavior. Now, if we move to the right-hand side, we look at the two time period. One is here, it's Great Depression. It's here, it's one Great Depression. The other is after World War II. First, virtually, if you compare these two group of data, what do you notice? Just virtually. To be precise, so this group of data versus this is what do you notice virtually? Just use eyebrow. I'm sorry?
It's higher, it gets higher.
It's higher. What else? In terms of slope. So like higher in terms of level, in terms of slope,
Like
steeper.
steep, yes, thank you.
Very, very good. Thank you. So now with two more steps. So yeah, so the observation is precise. It's excellent. Level up and getting steeper. Now, economically, what that means? Level up means what? Everyone consume more, given the same income. Number one. The getting steeper, what that means? Marginally, so everyone has stronger incentive to consume. Okay, this is second step. So now third step, what is behind the change? Now we are comparing 1930, which is like Great Depression, versus the time period after World War II. What is behind this change? What happened to US economy after World War II? Or maybe put it differently, what happened in Great Depression? Yes.
Well, is there like a job depression and then after the war, there were jobs created?
There are more jobs created, so the economy is in a very rosy mode, right? So that's like baby boomer generation. Everything becomes very bright. The future becomes very bright, right? And then so people have stronger incentive to consume, and in the margin they're going to consume more. So these actually reflect in the data. That's what the data told us. What happened in history. And then, so presumably, so if you look at 2020 data, and just if you look at the data monthly, what would you expect? Or to be precise, if we compare 2019 to 2020, what would you expect in terms of level and in terms of a slope? What would you expect? I would expect opposite to happen, right? But I mean, this is without the government support, right? So again, so that just we need to go to the next module. In 2020, everything becomes a little bit, flat, I mean, you're right. So I mean, in terms of economic outlook, everything becomes very bleak, right? So there wasn't much hope or pretty pessimistic about our economy. But certainly the government, what the government did, reverse course of history, but certainly it's come with some unintended consequence. We are going to pick up that in the next module, right? So now we move to the last part of this lecture. We are going to look at investment. Remember, so we wrote down the equation C and I. We just talked about C, now we look at I. If you look at the absolute value, I is small. Remember, so if we look at expenditure, 4 categories, C, I, G, and NA. So C is close to 70%, right? So that immediately means I is going to be small because the rest is going to be equal to like around 30%, right? Okay. However, even though it's small, but investment can drive the fluctuation of our economy in a very significant way. Let's look at the data. Here, so we have 6 episodes of recession. During the recession, usually people is going to adjust their behavior. Just imagine if someone in your family lost their job, what are you going to do? Are you going to spend more or spend less? Number one. Spend less. Very good. Now, what type of spending you're going to cut more? Like a stable or like a house or big items, tickets, big ticket, right? So big ticket items. Which one you're going to cut more in terms of spending? You want to eat less or you want to downsize your house or postpone your purchase in your new car or house? Your big ticket item, right? So because those are not necessary, you can always postpone. So that actually reflects in the data. Look at when recession is, consumption drops, not much. Why? Because really there isn't much you can cut in terms of your calorie, right? But however, you can see there's a huge drop in investment. This is true throughout history. So that's why we look at investment. Now, let's see what can cause investment to fluctuate or to change. There are 3 factors. Interest rate. What is interest rate? Like for us, what do you understand interest rate? Give you an example. Credit card, it carries the interest rate if there's a late payment. Student loan, there's an interest rate. Mortgage, there's the interest rate. If you buy a car by taking a loan, there's an interest rate. So those interest rate. Now, if the interest rate increase, are you going to borrow more or borrow less? Less. If you borrow less, meaning you can do less investment. This is number 1. Number 2, expected future real GDP. Let's just convert into something like individual understand. Just imagine if you're a business owner. You are expecting next year or next quarter, the demand is weak. Do you want to expand your business? No. So there's not much demand. If I expand my business, it's going to increase my cost, reduce my profit. Number 3, current level of production capacity. Now use another example. Imagine you are an owner of a restaurant. Currently, the reservation only hits like 60 or maximum like 70%. Do you want to expand your dining area or you want to shrink? Certainly you want to shrink. Or at the minimum, you not want to expand, right? Because you haven't used all your capacity yet. What's the point of investment? So it is true in the individual level. It's also true in the aggregate level, right? So that's what drives investment spending. By the way, in terms of investment spending, there's a term called planned investment spending. This is what the business decide to invest given their assessment regarding to the economy, regarding to interest rate, regarding to their expectation about the future, regarding to the current capacity, right? So they just see what happened and then plan, right? Right, so the following 3 slides is kind of replay what I just explained. There are 3 factors matters investment. I just skip those, leave that for you to read. Now, finally, we end up with this slides. This kind of link to the next lecture, right? So first, inventory. What is inventory? So stocks of good, how to satisfy future sale. Give you two examples. You go to Target. If you want to buy 1,000 of egg, the Target told you we don't have egg in stock. We never keep everything in stock. We have no inventory. You have to wait me to call the farmer. Do you think this is how the business do? It's very inconvenient, right? But that explains why there's inventory, because they want to satisfy your need and they don't know when you will come. Another example, you want to buy a car, you go to local car dealership. So what would you like is after the negotiation, you will drive a car home. Instead of they told you, okay, so we have this paper, pay me a down pay, and then I'm going to deliver a car in 3 or 5 months. That's not what you want. But certainly for car dealership, for grocery store, they carry a risk if they put a lot of things in their inventory, right? And certainty, so the demand is unpredictable. So that just implies to inventory investment. If the demand is weaker than they expected, because usually they just brings like new cars, brings new eggs on a regular basis, right? But if saving them given a past week, sorry, past month, probably is better. So they bring 10 cars as they planned, but they only sold 2, meaning their inventory is going to add by 8. On the other hand, they bring 10 cars, but the sale was crazy. They sold 20 cars. And then so the inventory is going to down by 10. So these 2 examples we'll classify as inventory investment. And this inventory investment is going to tell us the direction of our economy. Right? So now you have unplanned inventory investment. Essentially, it's the unplanned change is because the demand may not go as you plan. And finally, the actual investment spending equal to the plan plus unplanned. Right? But this unplanned inventory investment is going to give us a signal regarding to how the economy is going to head to. And in the next slides or next lecture, we are going to study what determines the total GDP in a short period of time.